Hi everybody who happened to click on this video. This is part 2 of my Bridgerton review, so if you haven't seen the first part, I'll link it in the description. And yes, I know this review is a week or so late, but I got busy with classes, so please pardon my absence from making this review. So I'm going to structure this video a little similarly but a little differently to the first part, because I've decided, instead of focusing on like what worked well and what didn't work well, I decided to divide sections into side plots / characters and talk about what I think worked really well and what didn't work well with these respective categories. So first up, obviously, I have to start with the main couple of the season, Benedict and Sophie. First off, the ending of the first part was criminal and put Benedict in such a low position in Sophie's eyes and the audience's eyes as well. And what I really appreciated is when they picked up in the second half is that the whole first episode after that horrific question was just Benedict being scolded by basically everybody and everyone explaining to him how terrible that makes him look in Sophie's eyes, and he's begun to start to realize her perspective and her point of view. And I know that the mid-season breaks in streaming services are a little bit questionable, but I think here the break really worked well with the story, like the fact that that's the question, and then you get mid-season break, and then you get the whole episode is addressing what happened, and I feel like to break it there makes a lot of sense. And yes, with streaming you always hope that everything would just come out at the same time, but I do think that the break and the narrative worked well here. It does not always work well with this, but I think here it did make sense. And I really like that he realized that what he thought he had asked her was for a future together, but that's not exactly what he asked her. And I like that he realized, like, this is what I wanted when I asked her this question. I thought there was a future in her being my mistress, but now I understand that that's not necessarily promising a future to someone. That's almost kind of degrading them in a way, and he understands that he wants to have a future with her. He just has to figure out how that will work first. And oh my god, Benedict's whole romantic evening with Sophie in the greenhouse was honestly so beautiful. The way he made an old, like, their own world for them to live in and be away from society, and like the fact is, like, it's like he's trying to do the math and he's sort of there, but he hasn't gotten there all the way. But he knows, yes, I want there to be a world where we can be together, and I'm trying to figure it out, and that he's actively trying to work towards it. And his coming out scene to Sophie was so well written because it applies closely with their relationship in a lot of ways. I know there were concerns going into the season that Benedict's bisexuality would be erased and replaced by the fact that he ended up with a woman, but his sexuality will never go away regardless of what gender he may end up with. I mean, that just goes with the whole idea of bi erasure, of just this belief that just because you're bisexual and you end up with someone of the opposite gender takes away your bisexuality. It doesn't do that at all. And the parallels between even though the relationship is, people of opposite gender, they still aren't socially accepted because of their class differences, and this works well with the idea of, like, Benedict being in a gay relationship would also not be socially acceptable, and that they're able to relate the two together of, like, love is love, nothing should stop love from happening, and that kind of idea of, like, both of these types of love aren't socially accepted. And it just really just showed how Benedict's bisexuality actually went into this story, even though, yes, this is not a homosexual relationship, but that it still applies here. And yes, there is a major difference between the acceptability of homosexual relationships in society versus heterosexual relationships in society, being compared class and gay relationships. Like, obviously that's not exactly a super direct comparison. You can't exactly, like, it's almost like comparing apples to oranges, but there are still similarities, and it was beautiful how they're able to relate it to their own love. And I think the main takeaway from Benedict's sexuality and his love story is that he was able to grow to accept a love that would not be respected by society, and that he's okay with living on the fringes of society. And I think it does still really tie into his bisexuality. Of his love story has always been about him not being conventional, him being atypical, his story being atypical, and that in the end he still follows this through and through. And I saw a video essay online saying that Benedict's love story does away with all his disregard for society and makes him to conform to society. And I really heavily disagree with this, because since in the book, Benedict and Sophie marry, and yes, her dowry makes it more socially acceptable. However, they still live in the country mainly in the book. In the book, the queen isn't a character, so they don't get like the seal of approval from the queen. Instead, they basically, I don't remember if they make up a lie, but her dowry makes it somewhat more socially acceptable for them to get married, but they still kind of have to live in the countryside, and they're not often in society. The only kind of society events they go to is when a relative is throwing some sort of party in the country. And, yes, in the show, they do prove their credibility of the queen. That doesn't necessarily mean that Benedict loves society now and he wants to live in it. Benedict and Sophie literally get married at my cottage. They're going to live in the country where they're happy. You know, the whole scenes of them in my cottages show that's the life they want, and they're going to live there. And yes, Benedict still doesn't like society. That wasn't his problem with having to leave it. He just couldn't cope with having to leave his family forever, not because of society. He still hates society and wants to live in the country, but if their relationship wasn't accepted, he wouldn't ever be able to see his family again. That was his hang up. It wasn't just that like all of a sudden he was like, I love society and I can't marry Sophie because I can't deal with not being socially accepted. No, he's never done anything to be like, I want to be socially accepted now. He just wanted to see his family. It didn't come from this sudden Benedict loves society now. He still hates society. They didn't have this big society wedding. They had a quiet wedding with only their friends there, and everything was much more subdued. There was no crazy, like, it's being sponsored by the queen or they're in a church or anything. It was in the country. And now moving on to Sophie, I loved her characterization in the show. I often talked about in this first part how I just loved her manic energy, and I love how she always has to be doing something, and I just feel like that applies so well to Benedict, and I feel like they just relate so much on that level. And I also love the way that she had prior knowledge to sex, which is just lovely, because a lot of my concerns of the steamy scenes in the books was that almost all of the female love interests didn't know what sex was, and it felt like how the guys treated it was a little assaultish because they didn't really explain anything. And can you really have consent if the other person doesn't know what they're doing? But I digress. I also loved how Sophie was tracking her menstrual cycle. I love good representation of women's body and the menstrual cycle in media, especially since for so long this just wasn't really socially acceptable to talk about on TV, and especially to the younger women watching Bridgerton, seeing Sophie do this may allow them more education and understanding about how ovulation and menstruation work and how to track that, and that even if you are a few days late doesn't necessarily mean you're pregnant. Sometimes that just means there's stress or you can be late without being pregnant. And I loved how she was actually educated about that and understood how it worked and had it marked in her little calendar. And we've moved so far in such a good direction from the first season of Bridgerton and the characters' understanding of like sex education, and I'm so glad. Also, the fact that Sophie was the one holding the reins in the relationship and telling Benedict off and not to distract her from her work was just chef's kiss. Like, it really just showed how whipped Benedict was for her, and also breaks down that whole class dynamic between the two of them. Like, Benedict clearly respects Sophie on like an equal level, and that class was never an issue with this. And also Sophie's insistence in not wanting to have bastards and Benedict's understanding of it was so heartbreaking, but it was important. I feel like Sophie's strength of character comes from the fact that she wants the best for her children, and she doesn't want them to bring them into a situation similar to her illegitimacy, because that's been such a mark on her life and her internal and external struggles. And I think this is the most intriguing approach in either wanting to have kids or not wanting to have kids. I feel like so far most of the characters' opinions on having kids have just been, oh, that's what society deems we have to do. Like, if we go back to season 1, Simon didn't want to have kids because he didn't want to continue his father's line. Then we have I feel like Kate and Anthony just kind of had their kid because they felt like they needed to, and then Penelope and Colin, they had to have a son in order for the Featheringtons to keep their estate and everything. And I just feel like this is the most interesting relationship with a character and with having kids and continuing a legacy. And I just feel like it adds a lot more depth to her character and her backstory, which backstory was so sorely missing from season 2 and 3. At least in season 2 we saw Anthony's, but we didn't see Kate's backstory, and we didn't see much Colin and Penelope flashbacks in season 3. So I like that we're going back to this idea of like backstory and making more complex characters with more depth and understanding why this is so integral to her character, and it just makes her such like an interesting character, that she's so steadfast in this belief of like, I want to have kids, but I don't want to have them this way, and you're gonna have to do this for me, or we're not gonna be able to be together. Sophie wanting to leave makes so much sense in the relation of like not wanting to have bastard children, and Benedict not being able to give her that to her. And even though she wanted that My Cottage fantasy so badly, she had to leave unless Benedict proposed, and also to get away from Araminta. I also just loved how I love Violet and Sophie's relationship. I love it in the books. I love it in the show. It's so special to me because Violet is the closest to Sophie out of all of the in-laws, because they were literally in the same household. Sophie was part of Violet's household before she was even married to Benedict. And Violet standing up for her in the books was just so... I love that scene. In the books, Violet pulls up to the jail and, like, stands off with Araminta and goes, like, why is my son's fiancé in prison? And I was so looking forward to that scene in the show, and I was so happy when it happened. And I just love that, you know, also the fact that Violet and Sophie have such a good relationship also fleshes out her relationship with Benedict so much, because you can see how Violet at first is a little bit hesitant about this relationship, as one would be, and then she starts to understand how much Sophie and Benedict actually care for each other, and that even she's like understanding that, like, she's sympathetic to Sophie. Like, yes, she wants Benedict to be happy, but she's sympathetic to Sophie wanting to leave, even if it goes against her child, because she can see Sophie is such an interesting character that Violet can understand. Like, once she finds out that Sophie's illegitimate, she understands she wants to marry Benedict, or she can't physically commit to this, and she understands that. And I just think that just goes to show how interesting their relationship is out of all the Bridgerton siblings so far, that Violet gets so involved in the story because she can relate to Sophie so much. And I remember seeing like something online about how, wow, Violet really knows who her favorite in-law, like, child-in-law is, and I think that's so funny, because she gave Benedict the grandmother's ring, which is so much fancier than the other rings that have been used so far. But again, I think it just goes to show, like, their relationship is so, it's like my favorite, and I know I'm very biased, but it's just, even if it is a Cinderella ripoff, I don't care. I just think their relationship is so well developed, and the way that they just can relate to each other, and the sacrifices they both have to make for each other is just so beautiful. And now moving on to the reveal, which was a big contention, I feel like, of how it was done. I loved how it was done with the necklace that made Benedict realize who Sophie was, because the necklace has such a more emotional weight to Sophie, and the fact that it was her mother's, and the fact that that remnant of her mother is how Benedict realizes who the Lady in Silver is. And also, that's such a small detail Benedict could remember about her. I know people were like, man, he couldn't recognize her face, but he could recognize her necklace. But that just shows how obsessed he was, that he could remember that little necklace on her neck. And it just makes the reveal of the Lady in Silver's identity much more personal and stronger to the relationship. In the book, Sophie's identity is revealed as she plays a game with Hyacinth and Eloise, which makes her wear a blindfold, and Benedict sees her with the blindfold, and suddenly he can remember her face because he sees the lower half of her face without the top half of her face. And it seemed a little on the nose in the book, since he literally had to see her how she was again to see it. And I feel like the necklace is just much more important to Sophie, and it also is much more revealing of the relationship, as Benedict should have already been able to recognize the lower half of her face, and it's just more meaningful that he recognizes the necklace. And to go on a little side tangent about Benedict not being able to recognize Sophie without the mask on, I go back to classic example of Clark Kent and his glasses. And the thing with Clark Kent and Superman is that when you're around someone, like if you are a personal friend of Clark Kent, you're around him so much that you have this very well constructed idea of who Clark Kent is in your head. Meanwhile, Superman's like flying above around you, and you can never put the two together because you just can't imagine the two as the same, because you have such a defined sense of Clark Kent. But Superman is more of like this like figure in your head, like a symbol of hope. Literally, I know that's a little cliche, but like he's just this almost fictional personality, almost like how we view a celebrity. So you could never imagine that someone that you know so well could be that person, because you have such different ideas of them in your head. And there's also a level of denial about, oh my god, like Clark Kent could never be Superman because I see how he is, and in the personality and context that you know Clark Kent, you're like, it's just impossible. So that's how I believe the writers approach Benedict not being able to recognize Sophie, because Benedict is this sees the Lady in Silver as this like idolized version of someone. It's almost imaginary and not real, and it has such fantastical elements to it that it's like just a fading memory in his brain that he just holds on to. Meanwhile, Sophie is real to him. He's spent so much more time with her, and she becomes her own person compared to this like flimsy memory that's slowly fading away in his brain as he becomes more and more focused on Sophie and who she is as a person. And he can't put the two together. And also, Benedict finishing her portrait at the end, and it's her without the mask on, was just so beautiful. Like, and it's the fact that it's the only painting he's really finished, and the fact that it was hung up on the wall. Yearning and Love in Bridgerton is so back. They are soulmates, and they make each other the best versions of themselves. Benedict was finally able to pursue his passion and finish his passion and finish a painting for the first time. And it was Sophie's influence that allowed him to finally put effort into something instead of doing what he did in all the previous seasons of bouncing around between lovers and bouncing around society, not being focused. Now she is the reason that he can become focused and he can pursue his passion, and they can live in the country as they always wanted to do and be together like they never dreamed they could at the beginning of the season. Okay, so I guess I should address the villains now. I love the dynamic in any Cinderella retelling of one of the stepsisters being good. And Posy, oh, I love Posy. I love the scene when she climbs out the window to warn Sophie about Araminta trying to find her. She's just so pure-hearted and naive and kind. And the actress is just so, I feel like she plays Posy so well. Like all her expressions, all her inflections of voice, I just feel like that innocence is just so like present. And it's just, I love a character with agency. I love a character that's willing to climb out the window for her stepsister. And Araminta is just such a good villain. A villain that you can just hate is so awesome. Even her justification of her treatment of Sophie is just so evil. The way she judged her father for having a previous relationship and having previous children is just so hypocritical. The fact that she's jealous of a woman who's not even alive and that her husband isn't even cheating on is just so insane. And even if Araminta's first marriage wasn't one of love, Sophie's father still loved her enough to make sure her children were taken care of, and she was taken care of in the will. And maybe he could even sense her evil tendencies towards Sophie because he made her house Sophie by giving her extra money. And also, a villain whose motivations are so twisted and so wrong is just so compelling. Like, even the glimpse you get into her mind when she tells Sophie that she just hated that her husband previously loved someone, it doesn't justify what she does, yet you can see how she connects these things in her head, and it just makes her seem that much more cruel. So now moving on to side plots and characters. First, we have Francesca, who I talked about a lot in my previous video, but when John touched his head, I turned to my friend and I legitimately started screaming at the screen, "John, no, John!" I was in so denial because I thought he wasn't going to die till the next season. And so when it finally happened, I was like, no way. And oh my God, Francesca's monologue to her mother was just so heartbreaking. And the fact that she was so clearly neurodivergent and in a lot of the ways of how she handled the funeral and grieving just broke my heart. Like, she was so obsessed with making sure everything else was perfect and proper, and that she was masking her emotions the whole time and just trying to seem presentable, because that's what has been drilled into her head, is to be presentable to society. And the fact that she is introverted and can't deal well with like social situations, oh my God, my Shayla. And to her, it's like there was no time to grieve because she had to handle the funeral and the people and the family and like everything else, that she just couldn't let herself. And the fact that she believed if she grieved she would miscarry, oh my God. And then when she talked to Violet about losing her husband, and Violet didn't understand what Francesca was coming from, oh my Lord. Like, it was like, part of me was like, yes, pop off, Francesca, but then the other part of me just broke, because it was so heartbreaking to see Francesca so lost and so in pain over what she thought was her own failing of not being able to give John a child. And in the previous part of my review, I talked about how Francesca's insistence on needing to get pregnant and give John a child came from the fact that she was only doing it because that's what she believed she had to do as a good wife. And again, if she's neurodivergent, that's like her way of like masking and coping with society, is she's trying to be what she's trying to be a wife, and to her a wife is having children. And Francesca tried loving John in the only way she knew how, which was to marry him and give him children. And when he died and she couldn't complete the second part of what she viewed as that contract, it just broke her down completely. And regardless of how her sexuality falls, she loved John in the only way that she was capable of and the only way she knew how. And because of her neurodivergent coded personality, I begin to wonder if she's lesbian or falls in the aro ace spectrum. But I guess we'll only know for sure once her season rolls around, and we'll get into that a little bit. The thing is about Francesca's book is it's about learning to love again and finding love that is different, but that difference doesn't detract away from that first love. And if Francesca is lesbian, she loved John in a platonic love, which is still a strong form of love, and she tried to love him as much as her sexuality allowed her. And finding love with Michaela would be a new romantic love. And so her season would become about transitioning between the difference of that strong platonic love and that strong romantic love. And in those ways, those are two different kinds of ways to love. However, if Francesca is aro ace, then the love changes between maybe loving something as closely as possible without fully being aware of the sexual nature of that love. And perhaps that is what she can learn with Michaela. Often with aro ace people, it takes them a while to reach the ability to get to that part of a relationship. And I feel like maybe that's what Michaela could show her, and that is what she learns and takes away. Or if she is a lesbian, it could just be that she felt that she had to give John something that she was not capable of, which would be a different kind of love. But either way, it doesn't really matter how her sexuality falls, because any way it falls, her finding love with Michaela and John, they have their own respective ways of how that happens. And at first I was worried that when John died, that their love would be cheapened a bit because of Francesca's sexuality. But seeing her grieve the way that she did made me realize that she did really love John, and that maybe her hesitancy with, the sexual part of the relationship and everything was just her trying, and her neurodivergency trying for her to try to be what she thought she had to be, and then eventually she realizes that that's not all that there is. And I just feel like I was pretty naive when I first watched the first part. And Michaela leaving makes sense not only for the guilt she may feel for harboring feelings for Francesca, but because of the weight of her homosexual feelings at this time in society. It's clearly stated that John may have understood this about Michaela, and that's why he didn't mind that she didn't get married. And I think Michaela's inner complexities overshadows Michael's in the books by a landslide. In the book, Michael's main source of guilt for leaving was that he felt like he caused John's death because of his coveting of Francesca. Because he was in love with Francesca, he felt that he caused John to die. Meanwhile, with Michaela, she has that on top of all the complexities that come with being in a homosexual relationship at the time. And honestly, Shonda Rhimes is truly a genius. I'm sorry I ever doubted her. And in the vein of Francesca's infertility story in the books, it's still represented in the show. And I could see her being so traumatized by that evil doctor that she could not even think about ever wanting to have kids again. And honestly, Francesca wanting to get remarried to have kids like she does in the book, I feel like that doesn't necessarily have to translate to the show. And maybe that's how her season starts. But then she realizes her true feelings for Michaela. But even at the wedding, we see when Penelope unfortunately asked her, would you get married again? So soon after her husband died. A little questionable, Penelope, but okay. It seemed like she just wasn't really interested in that. And so I could see that kind of plot of her book kind of fading away to the back and not really being a main thing. And, I'm just so thrilled and curious to see how Bridgerton will handle a gay relationship, and I'm hoping so hard right now that Brimsley swings in as an advocate and Queen Charlotte sees Brimley's love story and Francesca and Michaela's love story and legalizes gay marriage. That would just be so tea, but I'm probably being a little bit idealistic, but I mean, the Bridgerton world is so far from reality that I mean, anything could happen at this point. Moving on to Violet, I know many people were upset that her and Lady Danbury's brother did not end up together, but I was so happy when that happened because realistically, Violet has been so wrapped up in getting her children settled and married that she hasn't really been able to be herself. I mean, she's been a single parent plus some of Anthony's help for so long, for so many years, and I love that she was able to explore her sexuality and appreciate her body in this season, and that this is all part of her journey. I think when I watched the first part, I turned to my friend and I said, I hope this is just a casual relationship because I wanted Violet to have a hoe phase. I mean, every girl needs a hoe phase at some point. I mean, not even every girl. Everybody needs to have a hoe phase and explore their sexuality at some point. And for Violet, sex used to always result in pregnancy, but now she doesn't have to worry about that, hopefully. So she can just explore all she wants. And now she can have a sneaky link, water that garden, tend the garden, discover more about herself. And when Violet was talking to Benedict about how she realized that Benedict had aspects of her younger self, that was her realizing that she wanted to find that part of herself again. Now Violet can have time for hobbies for herself to discover that little adventurous girl again. And if she married Lord Anderson, she would have been swept away in preparing the wedding, merging their households, and having a new husband to worry about. But now she's free to be herself, and now half her children are out of the house, and really she only has Eloise, Gregory, and Hyacinth still living at home, so there's so much time and space for her to explore that part of herself that got lost when she became a mother and a wife. Next up is Eloise and Hyacinth. Eloise was able to finally shrug off her preconceptions about marriage and realize it's important to a lot of women like her sister. Before, Eloise was so jaded and flippant and uncaring about marriage as an institution that she hurt the feelings of so many characters, not just Hyacinth. Hyacinth's grief of losing John and denouncing marriage made Eloise realize how important marriage was to Hyacinth, not just the aesthetics of it or the societal pressure towards it. And this is hopefully where the beginning of Eloise or Hyacinth respective romances will take place. And within these stories, there can be infertility struggles taken from Francesca's wanting to have kids but unable to physically for a long time, because I do not necessarily believe that Francesca will want to have kids. I feel like there's always that was just her trying to give that to John. And if they do Eloise's story, she can gain children unconventionally by adopting Marina's children, as I assume Eloise would be disgusted at the concept of birthing children. And also at the same time, it could be applied to Hyacinth because she's so devoted to the idea of marriage and kids. And this could just be a nice addition to her story to be representative of that. But I could also see them leaving Eloise's story behind and leaving her a spinster. I mean, that would be really progressive, and I would love to see it. Honestly, I just feel like that makes sense for her character, because she's always been so anti-marriage. I don't really see her changing her mind about it. Even after all Hyacinth taught her, she has appreciation for it, but I don't necessarily think that's her being like, I want to get married now. And I would be fine if they left out her story. I hated Philip in the books, and maybe one day I'll make a video about why To Sir Philip with Love is my least favorite Bridgerton book, but all I have to say is I won't miss it if this show leaves it out, honestly. And the Queen and Lady Danbury, they're such a good representation of friendship growing and evolving over time. Lady Danbury needs to go back home, and even though Charlotte didn't want to lose her friend, she knew that's what she needed. Friendship means sacrifice and sometimes losing touch with another for a short while. Also, the way that they wordlessly communicated to each other that Lady Danbury could go was just beautiful. The fact that no words were said, but their expressions were enough for each other to understand what the other was saying, even if they couldn't announce it in words, was just so beautiful. It just shows how well they know each other and how long and just beautiful their friendship has been. And I just love how Charlotte was finally able to separate her apathy towards society with grabbing onto Lady Danbury for support. She's able to find some joy again in society and allow Agatha to go. And Shonda, you better not kill off Charlotte though, or else I don't know what I'll do. I'll storm somewhere. I'll storm Netflix's offices. I don't know. Okay, so moving on to Penelope and Colin. Man, they were sidelined in the second half of the show. Sidelined in their own season and sidelined as a side plot. My hope for Penelope is that after giving up Whistledown that she starts to write novels. Like, I'm thinking like Pen is like Jane Austen. Like, she just becomes Jane Austen in the universe. And I'm so glad for this shift in narratives. Since this season, we begin to see Penelope's apathy towards reporting on society, and unfortunately Colin's perspective of ruining people. The only thing I didn't exactly understand was the mistress being Penelope's main reason for leaving Whistledown, because there were way worse people she ruined than that. And also I just feel like the mistress should have realized that regardless of what Penelope did as Whistledown, the Lord never meant anything serious. If anything, Penelope did her a favor, because even if it wasn't Penelope to say it, someone was going to say something and the Lord would have dropped her anyway. And also, the fact that Whistledown didn't report on Benedict or Sophie was such an interesting choice. I feel like every other scandal in every other season was reported in exact detail, and that the fact that their marriage was so drama-free was disappointing, honestly. Like, every season had this big conflict with Lady Whistledown, except in the arguably one of the most scandals we have had so far, of this idea of a lord marrying someone of lower class, which would have been like so drama that Whistledown just didn't report on it. And like I said, I just feel like Penelope was really, really sidelined in this regard. Also, her reason for retirement, I wish would have come from a more internal source of wanting to write like novels or literature or something she was actually passionate about, and realizing she had passion for it, instead of just, oh my god, gossip ruins people and I'm kind of done with that, you know? But I will say, the one shot of her looking into the mirror at her past self and now looking at her beautiful, like glamorous, like dressed in cool shades instead of citrus colors, and having her hair actually natural instead of overly curled and everything, was really beautiful. And I think it's such a good representation of girlhood and like growing up and still looking back and having appreciation for the person you were, but being able to accept the person you are now. And this does also go back and parallels Violet's realization of wanting to look back and become the person she was before. And even though the scene carried so much emotional weight, it felt like it belonged in the previous season. I feel like they rushed Penelope and Colin's like conclusion so much that this should have been some sort of conclusion in the third season, and they just didn't have room for it. And I mean, imagine if this season was in the third season, and this is like in the penultimate episode where she realizes that she wants to come out to the world as Lady Whistledown, or that she realizes that, you know, in her love of Colin, she still is the girl that she once was, and that she was the wallflower that used to hide in the back and not talk to anybody. But now she's such a prominent figure in society who has so much influence and weight in society. And I just feel like if this was in the third season, it would have been so much more powerful to her love story and her story of identity and making the decision to come out as Lady Whistledown. I just feel like that would have just been so much more, I don't know, it just would have had so much more of an impact in the third season. And also, Colin, he was basically non-existent in the season. I could not tell you a single thing he did besides broke boyfriend hug Penelope in the first half. He didn't even have any conversation with Benedict about what was going on in Benedict's story at all. And speaking of sideline characters, Canthony, it was honestly like a game of whack-a-mole where Anthony popped up to scold Benedict, then he completely disappeared until the post-credit scene. Also, Kate showed up with the baby, didn't really interact with anyone, and then was at the wedding, and that was like just it. I feel like she didn't do anything else. And I understand that there probably were conflicting schedules with Jonathan Bailey, considering he had so many projects going on at the time, but still, like, when Anthony became a little bit of a villain again, I was like, oh my god, season 1 Anthony is coming back. And the aspect of the brothers getting into arguments is so interesting. Like, the conflict within the Bridgerton family just is such, like, an interesting, like, I wish we could go back to that season 1 era of, like, there's so much conflict within the Bridgerton household, and Anthony's still a little bit has villain tendencies, even though, like, it's just him trying to look out for his family, because he's so obviously, like, first son coded, and that he has to be in charge of everything, and the idea of him being a villain again was so, like, interesting, but then he just disappeared, and, like, it would have added so much complexity to Benedict feeling like a spare and feeling like he wasn't needed anymore once Kate and Anthony had their baby. I feel like that could have also been explored, but again, he just disappeared. And again, the main conflict was Sophie going to jail, which was a good final conflict to have, but there was no final confrontation with the brothers and, like, Benedict being like, I'm gonna do this. Like, there was nothing. And, like, there was no Anthony arguing with Violet of her support of the relationship or anything. And it just felt like, where do you go? Like, he just disappeared. And then they just reconciled off camera, and suddenly it's the wedding. Like, I just feel like there could have been more of a resolution with that. But characters that are often sidelined that actually got to be in the spotlight were the serving staff. The upstairs-downstairs dynamic was so Downton Abbey, like, esque, that it just added so much to the world of Bridgerton. Like, I love their little gossip circles, and that was kind of previously mentioned with Penelope's Whistledown connections, but it was nice seeing that more in the forefront, and also highlighting the servants in the season about class disparity was a given, but I just love that they got their own little side plots, and that the characters had their own personality, like Footman John and Hazel having their little side romance, and also, one concluding thought about all my opinions on season 4 is just how the side plots were handled so much better than the third season. In season 3, the side plots took over the story at points and detracted from Colin and Penelope's love story. Meanwhile, in season 4, all the side plots kind of related to the main story in one way or another. Each character had something to teach the main couple or to build up the conflict or tension. And even if they didn't exactly start off as being related to the main couple, they still had ripple effects. Like, for example, Lady Danbury seeking out Lady Mondrich as being her replacement as, like, a lady in waiting to the queen was, at first it's like, okay, this is for Charlotte and Agatha's conflict, but in the end it actually affected what happened with Benedict and Sophie, that she was the one to get the queen to accept them. But it still made Lady Mondrich a more interesting character than she was in season 3, but it still related back to the story and had actual like stakes on the story. And also, again, with going back to Violet, at first her whole relationship with Lord Anderson was, at first was like, yes, it's her finding herself, but then her finding herself let her relate back to Benedict and be like, I always thought you were the one most like me, and they have that beautiful moment. And that's still related to Benedict realizing that, like, he's always been unconventional and that he does still want to commit to Sophie. And even though Francesca's story is required to be fleshed out before her season, it still had an effect on the other characters and the effect on Sophie and Benedict, because it let Sophie see Benedict in such a vulnerable position where he was like, I do really, really care about you. And then she was able to realize, like, wow, he does actually really care about me. Like the scene where he tells her to go away because he'll break down if she doesn't go away because he loves her so much and he can't imagine what happened with John to happen to her. So it's just like, it still makes sense and it still has weight on the characters, even though it is crucial to Francesca's story and it will build up to her season later. It still has an impact on the main couple, and I feel like season 3 failed to do this. Like, the Benedict love triangle arc, what did that serve to Colin and Penelope? It didn't serve to any purpose. So, like, it's like and I'm trying to think of other side plots, but they're honestly so aggravating and forgetful that I don't remember. But they even fixed Cressida. They even fixed Cressida from season 3. It feels like they amended all the problems that were in season 3 and fixed it. Like, Cressida didn't have to marry that stinky old man. She got to marry a younger hot guy, and even like Eloise and Cressida make up. And this is also added into Eloise's understanding of why marriage is important to some people. So, like, even then, they fixed so many things that were wrong with season 3. And, like, this is how life works. Like life, all these people around each other influence each other's lives. It's almost like osmosis, where being around people creates a reaction in your life that it changes how you see the world, or it gives you new perspective on things. And I feel like this is handled so well in this season. Like, every character has an impact on one another, indirect or not, or straightly just direct. Like, they all kind of have effects on each other, and that worked really well in this season, and all the side plots tied together so nicely like a little bow. And Bridgerton, they found each other. They found themselves again. And regardless of who the next couple is, even if it is Eloise and Philip, who I hated in the books, I have faith that they will be able, if they continue this hype of the season, continue all the things they fixed in the season, surely any story they adapt, even Eloise and Philip, it will be a banger. They have found their footing again, and they have figured out the balance of side plots to the main characters, and they have done it so well and so beautifully, and they're just addressing so many aspects that were sort of in the book, but now they're just at the forefront, and anything they do from the future on, I'm excited to see.
Enchanted to me.